In 1705, the British government made a promise that would cost them the equivalent of over $500 million in today's money. They promised to build a palace. Not just any palace, the largest non-royal residence in all of England, bigger than most royal palaces across Europe, and they promised to pay for every single brick. The recipient? John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough. His crime? Winning a battle. But here's what nobody tells you about Blenheim Palace. The construction nearly bankrupted a national treasury. It destroyed a royal friendship that had lasted decades. It created political scandals that consumed Parliament for 20 years. And it ruined the very family it was meant to honor. By the time the last stone was laid, the costs had exploded by over 600%. The Queen had cut off all funding in disgrace. The architect had fled the country. And the Churchill family was drowning in debt they would carry for generations. Most historians call it Britain's greatest architectural achievement. I'm going to show you why it was actually one of the most catastrophic financial and political disasters in British history. And here's what no one's talking about. Every single warning sign was visible from day one. The government ignored them all. If you're ready to see what really happened behind the gilded walls of Blenheim Palace, let's begin. August 13, 1704. The Battle of Blenheim. John Churchill, leading a combined English and Austrian force, crushes the French and Bavarian armies. 13,000 enemy soldiers dead, 14,000 captured. The French commander drowns trying to escape. It's the first major defeat France has suffered in over 50 years. London erupts in celebration. Queen Anne is ecstatic. Churchill has saved Europe from French domination. He's secured Protestant succession. He's made England the dominant military power on the continent, and Anne wants to reward him. But not with money, not with titles. He already has those. She wants to build him a palace, the royal manor of Woodstock, 2,000 acres, prime Oxfordshire land. She grants it to Churchill outright, and then she makes the promise. The Crown will pay for the construction of a palace on this land, a monument to Churchill's victory, a symbol of British military supremacy. Parliament approves the plan in 1705. The estimated cost, £50,000. In today's money, that's approximately $12 million. Expensive, yes. But for a national hero who had just saved Europe, Parliament agrees it's worth it. Construction begins immediately. But here's the first warning sign everyone missed. There was no contract, no written agreement, no detailed budget, no project timeline, just a verbal promise from a queen to build a palace. And verbal promises don't mean much when the money runs out. Queen Anne appoints John Vanbrugh as the architect. Vanbrugh has designed exactly one building in his entire life, Castle Howard, which is still under construction. He's not trained as an architect. He's a playwright and a soldier. But he has vision. Grand, sweeping, impossibly ambitious vision. And he has Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, constantly in his ear. Sarah is Queen Anne's closest friend. They've been inseparable for decades. Anne calls her Mrs. Freeman. Sarah calls Anne Mrs. Morley. They write to each other daily. Sarah wants a palace that will dwarf every aristocratic residence in England. Vanbrugh agrees to deliver exactly that. The initial plans are staggering. A central block with 4 massive wings, a grand bridge spanning an entire valley, staterooms that could fit entire houses inside them, carvings, sculptures, and architectural details on every surface. The main facade alone stretches 856 feet. For comparison, Buckingham Palace's facade is 354 feet. Blenheim would be more than twice the size. Vanbrugh presents these plans in 1705. The estimated cost is still £50,000. But here's what nobody's talking about. That estimate was pure fiction. Vanbrugh knew it, Sarah knew it, Churchill probably knew it, but Queen Anne had promised, Parliament had approved, and the foundations were already being dug. So everyone stayed quiet. And the costs started climbing. By 1707, 2 years into construction, £70,000 has already been spent. That's 40% over budget, and the palace is barely 10% complete. The foundations alone have consumed £22,000. In today's money, over $5 million just for foundations. Why so expensive? The site is terrible. Vanbrugh chose it for its dramatic views, not its structural integrity. The ground is marshy, unstable. It requires massive engineering work just to support the weight of the building. Thousands of tons of stone must be hauled in. Entire sections require deep pilings. The water table keeps flooding the construction site. But Vanbrugh refuses to compromise his vision. The Grand Bridge becomes the perfect example. Vanbrugh designs a bridge with 33 rooms inside it. Rooms inside a bridge. It spans 450 feet across a tiny stream you could jump over. The Duchess of Marlborough calls it a mad extravagance. She's right. But Vanbrugh argues it's architecturally necessary for the overall composition. Construction continues. By 1708, the cost reaches £100,000, double the original estimate. Parliament starts asking questions. Treasury officials demand a detailed accounting. They want to know where the money is going. Vanbrugh provides vague reports, stone, labor, materials, engineering challenges, but no detailed breakdowns, no itemized budgets. Parliament is growing suspicious, but here's the real problem. Nobody wants to stop construction. If they stop now, they've wasted £100,000 with nothing to show for it. If they continue, maybe they can finish the project and salvage something. It's the sunk cost fallacy on a national scale, so they keep funding it, and the costs keep rising. Now let's look at the relationship that would ultimately destroy everything. Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill. They'd been friends for over 20 years. Sarah had been Anne's confidant, her advisor, her closest companion, but the palace was creating tension. Anne was hearing complaints from Parliament, questions about the costs, whispers about waste and extravagance, and Sarah wasn't helping. Sarah was demanding, imperious, and increasingly contemptuous of Anne's concerns. When Anne raised questions about costs, Sarah dismissed them. When Anne suggested modifications to save money, Sarah accused her of being ungrateful. When Anne tried to discuss the political implications, Sarah lectured her about loyalty. By 1709, their relationship was fracturing. But the breaking point wasn't about the palace, it was about politics. Sarah was a fierce Whig. She pushed Anne constantly to favor Whig politicians. Anne was exhausted by Sarah's pressure. She started relying on a new confidant, Abigail Masham, Sarah's own cousin. Abigail was a Tory, quiet, deferential, agreeable. Everything Sarah wasn't. Sarah was furious. She accused Abigail of manipulation. She accused Anne of betrayal. The palace became a proxy for their dying friendship. Every funding request became a test of loyalty. Every cost overrun became an accusation. By 1710, they weren't speaking. Sarah had lost all influence over the Queen. And here's the kicker. Without Sarah's influence, there was nobody protecting the palace's funding. In August 1710, Queen Anne dismissed Sarah from all her court positions. The funding for Blenheim Palace stopped immediately, not reduced, stopped. After £220,000 had been spent, the Treasury cut off every penny. In today's money, $55 million spent, and construction was perhaps 40% complete. The moment the funding stopped, the political attacks began. Opposition newspapers called it Marlborough's folly. Pamphleteers published detailed accounts of the waste, the bridge that cost £10,000 and served no purpose. The marble imported from Italy at enormous expense. The hundreds of craftsmen working on decorative elements while basic structure remained incomplete. Parliament launched investigations. How had costs increased by 440%? Why were there no contracts? Who authorized the extravagant design elements? And why had the Treasury kept funding the project for so long? The answers were damning. There had been no oversight. Vanbrugh had essentially unlimited authority. The Treasury had approved expenses without detailed review. It was government waste on a spectacular scale. But here's what nobody's talking about. The scandal wasn't really about the money. It was about politics. The Tories, now in power, wanted to destroy the Marlborough's reputation. John Churchill had been a Whig ally. Sarah had been the Whigs' most influential voice at court. Attacking Blenheim Palace was a way to attack everything the Marlboroughs represented. The palace became a symbol of Whig excess, of military overreach, of personal enrichment at public expense. None of it was entirely fair. Churchill had genuinely won one of the most important battles in European history. But politics isn't about fairness, and the Marlboroughs were about to pay a devastating price. With government funding gone, construction halted. Hundreds of workers were dismissed. Materials lay exposed to the elements. Unfinished walls began deteriorating. John Churchill was in Germany, leading military campaigns. He returned to find his great monument half-built and abandoned. He faced a choice: walk away and let the palace rot, or pay for it himself. He chose to pay. But here's the brutal reality. Churchill was wealthy, but not palace-building wealthy. His fortune was approximately £60,000. In today's money, about $15 million. The palace still needed at least £150,000 to complete, over $37 million in today's terms. He didn't have it. So he borrowed. He took loans against his estates. He sold properties. He diverted income from his military positions, and he pushed construction forward. But it was slow. Agonizingly slow. With limited funds, Vanbrugh could only employ a fraction of the workforce. What should have taken years stretched into decades. Sarah was furious. She blamed Vanbrugh for the extravagant design. She blamed Anne for cutting off funding. She blamed the Tories for their political attacks. But mostly, she blamed herself for losing Anne's favor. The palace was destroying her psychologically. Every unfinished wall was a reminder of her failure. Every mounting debt was a testament to her miscalculation. By 1716, John Churchill suffered a stroke. He was partially paralyzed, unable to speak clearly. The stress had broken him. Sarah took over management of the construction and immediately went to war with Vanbrugh. Sarah Churchill and John Vanbrugh hated each other. Sarah called him incompetent, wasteful, and obstinate. Vanbrugh called her difficult, unreasonable, and impossible to satisfy. They were both right. Sarah wanted to cut costs. Vanbrugh wanted to preserve his artistic vision. Every decision became a battle. Sarah demanded cheaper materials. Vanbrugh refused to compromise quality. Sarah wanted to eliminate decorative elements. Vanbrugh argued they were essential to the composition. Sarah wanted to simplify the design. Vanbrugh said it would ruin the palace. By 1717, their relationship had completely broken down. Vanbrugh submitted bills for his work. Sarah refused to pay them. Vanbrugh demanded access to the construction site. Sarah banned him. In 1719, Vanbrugh wrote Sarah a letter. He was done. He abandoned the project, walked away from his greatest work, unfinished. He would never see Blenheim Palace completed. And here's the tragic irony. Sarah brought in Nicholas Hawksmoor, Vanbrugh's assistant, to finish the work. Hawksmoor completed the palace exactly as Vanbrugh had designed it. Every element Sarah had fought against, Hawksmoor built. The palace was finally finished in 1722. Total construction time, 17 years. Total cost, £300,000. In today's money, approximately $75 million, 6 times the original estimate. Let me show you what those cost overruns actually meant. £300,000 in 1722 was an enormous sum. For comparison, the entire annual revenue of the British Treasury in 1722 was approximately £5.6 million. Blenheim Palace consumed the equivalent of 5.4% of 1 year's total government revenue. That's like the U.S. government spending $200 billion today on a single house. For one family. As a thank you gift. But the financial cost was only part of the damage. The political cost was devastating. The scandal around Blenheim contributed to the Whigs' loss of power in 1710. It damaged the reputation of military funding for years. It made Parliament deeply suspicious of any large-scale government construction projects. The personal cost to the Marlboroughs was even worse. John Churchill never recovered from his stroke. He lived in the completed palace for just 3 years before dying in 1722. He never got to enjoy his reward. Sarah lived until 1744, 44 years after construction began. She spent those years fighting lawsuits over the palace's debts, paying off contractors, settling claims. The palace that was supposed to honor her husband's greatest triumph became her greatest burden. And here's what most people don't know. The Churchill family struggled financially for generations. They had to sell off properties to maintain Blenheim. The palace's upkeep alone consumed much of their income. It wasn't until 1874, 152 years after completion, that the family's fortunes were restored. How? The seventh Duke of Marlborough married Consuelo Vanderbilt, an American railroad heiress. Her dowry was $2.5 million. In today's money, approximately $78 million. The American money finally paid off the debts created by the British palace. The reward for winning a battle in 1704 wasn't fully paid for until 1874. Wait a minute. If this story is so dramatic, so financially catastrophic, so politically explosive, why isn't it more widely known? Why do people celebrate Blenheim Palace as a triumph of British architecture without discussing the disaster behind it? Let me give you 7 reasons why this truth stays buried. Reason 1. Heritage organizations control the narrative. Blenheim Palace is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's managed by a charitable foundation. It generates millions in tourism revenue every year. These organizations have zero incentive to emphasize the scandals. Their marketing focuses on the beauty, the history, the Churchill connection. They talk about the architecture, the gardens, the art collection. They don't talk about the cost overruns, the political scandals, or the family ruin. Tourism doesn't sell disaster stories. Reason 2, it's tied to a national hero. John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, is one of Britain's greatest military commanders. His victory at Blenheim was genuinely significant. It changed the course of European history. Criticizing the palace feels like criticizing him, and Britain doesn't like to tarnish its military heroes. So the palace gets reframed, not as government waste, but as appropriate recognition for extraordinary service. The narrative shifts from, "This cost way too much," to, "He deserved it." Reason 3, the architectural establishment protects it. Blenheim Palace is considered John Vanbrugh's masterpiece. It's studied in architecture schools, featured in textbooks, held up as an example of English Baroque at its finest. Architectural historians have invested careers in celebrating this building, admitting that the design was fundamentally flawed, that the scale was inappropriate, that the costs were disastrous, would undermine decades of scholarship, so they focus on the aesthetics and ignore the economics. Reason 4, the family still lives there. The 12th Duke of Marlborough currently resides at Blenheim Palace. His family has spent 2.5 centuries managing the building's legacy. They've written books, given interviews, and shaped public perception, and they have no interest in highlighting that their ancestral palace nearly destroyed their family. The official family histories emphasize triumph, not trauma. Reason 5, it's a class issue. Talking about Blenheim's cost overruns means asking uncomfortable questions. Why did a single family receive such extraordinary government funding? Why was there so little oversight? Why did the aristocracy protect this project even as costs spiraled? These questions challenge Britain's class structure, and institutions that benefit from that structure don't like those questions asked. Reason 6, the records are scattered. Detailed financial records from the construction are incomplete. Some were never properly kept. Others have been lost. Many are held in private family archives with restricted access. Without comprehensive documentation, researchers struggle to piece together the full financial picture, and incomplete evidence makes it easier to dispute the scandal. Reason 7, it ultimately succeeded. Here's the most important reason. Blenheim Palace stands today. It's magnificent. It attracts visitors from around the world. The Churchill family survived. They kept the palace. They eventually prospered. When something succeeds in the end, people forget the disasters along the way. The outcome justifies the process. We see the palace. We don't see the cost. But I'm showing you the cost. And it was enormous. You might think this is just a historical curiosity, a scandal from 3 centuries ago that has no modern relevance. You'd be wrong. This exact pattern repeats constantly. Let me show you. In 2012, Paul Allen, Microsoft co-founder, commissioned a mega yacht called Octopus. Original budget, $200 million. Final cost, $400 million, with annual maintenance of $20 million. By 2022, Allen's estate was struggling to sell it. The yacht had become a financial burden. Same pattern. Extravagant vision, costs spiral, becomes a burden. In 2008, the Beijing Olympics were supposed to cost $1.6 billion. Final cost, $44 billion. Many of the venues are now abandoned. The city is still paying off the debt. Government project, underestimated costs, political pressure prevented cancellation, legacy of debt. Sound familiar? In 1999, Mike Tyson was worth $300 million. By 2003, he declared bankruptcy. Why? Massive spending on estates, cars, and entourages. His Connecticut mansion cost $2.8 million to buy and over $400,000 annually to maintain. He couldn't afford it. Lost everything: personal wealth, lavish properties, insufficient income to maintain them, ruin. The pattern never changes. Someone achieves something extraordinary. They're rewarded with something extravagant. The extravagance costs more than anyone predicted. The costs become unsustainable. The reward becomes a curse. And here's the real lesson. Display destroys wealth. The moment you build something to impress others, you've started losing money. Blenheim Palace was built to display British power, military triumph, and aristocratic grandeur. It succeeded at all three, and it nearly bankrupted everyone involved. But let me show you something even more disturbing. The people we've been talking about, the Churchills, Queen Anne, Vanbrugh, these were the famous casualties. What about everyone else? The contractors who were never paid in full, the craftsmen who worked for years and then saw the project abandoned, the local businesses that extended credit and never got repaid. When construction stopped in 1710, over 400 workers were dismissed immediately. No severance, no final payments, just dismissed. Many of these craftsmen had relocated their families to Oxfordshire specifically for this project. They'd been promised years of work, gone. The stone suppliers who had quarried thousands of tons of limestone on credit, many went bankrupt when payments stopped. The Italian marble merchants who shipped materials across Europe, they sued for years trying to recover their costs. Here's a specific example that shows the ripple effects. A master stonemason named Edward Strong worked on Blenheim from 1705 to 1710. He employed 60 men. When funding stopped, he had to lay off all of them. He'd extended credit to the project worth £3,000, about $750,000 today. The Churchills eventually paid him £1,200, less than half. Strong went from being one of England's most successful stonemasons to struggling financially for the rest of his life. And he was one of the lucky ones who got paid something. Dozens of smaller contractors got nothing. But here's what really happened. The palace wasn't just a burden on the Churchill family. It was a burden on an entire regional economy. Woodstock, the town adjacent to Blenheim, had oriented its entire economy around the construction. Inns, supply shops, food vendors, transportation services. When construction slowed to a crawl after 1710, the economic impact devastated the town. Population declined, businesses closed, the town didn't recover for decades. One palace, one family's reward, hundreds of destroyed livelihoods. Nobody talks about this because it's not glamorous, it's not part of the architectural triumph story, but it's real, and it matters. Now let's talk about what this did to the people at the center. Sarah Churchill lived for 22 years after the palace was completed. She became obsessed with justifying the expense. She wrote thousands of letters defending her decisions. She published documents trying to clear her name. She couldn't let it go. The palace had become her identity, her failure, her burden. She spent her final years alone. Her friendship with Anne had ended in 1710. Her husband died in 1722. Her children were estranged. The palace stood, but she was isolated. And here's the devastating detail. In 1742, 2 years before her death, Sarah wrote a letter to her granddaughter. She called Blenheim Palace that heap of stones and said she wished it had never been built, the monument to her husband's greatest triumph, the project she'd fought for decades to complete, the building that had consumed her fortune and her reputation. She wished it didn't exist. Think about that. 20 years after completion, the woman who had pushed hardest for the palace's creation regretted everything. Not because it wasn't beautiful. It was. Not because it wasn't impressive. It was. But because the cost, financial, political, personal, had been too high. Vanbrugh died in 1726, 7 years after abandoning the project. He never reconciled with Sarah. He never saw his completed work. His final years were spent designing other buildings and writing plays. But Blenheim haunted him. He'd created his masterpiece and been driven away from it. His reputation suffered. Critics used the Blenheim scandal to attack his other works. Commissions dried up. The palace that should have crowned his career ended up damaging it. And John Churchill himself, the man who won the Battle of Blenheim, who saved Europe, who earned this reward. He spent his final 3 years in the completed palace, partially paralyzed from his stroke. He couldn't speak clearly. He couldn't walk easily. He was a shadow of the military genius who had conquered Europe. The stress of the construction, the political attacks, the financial burden, it had broken him. His reward became his prison. But the damage went beyond individuals. Blenheim Palace fundamentally changed how the British government handled rewards for military service. After the scandal, Parliament never again approved such lavish construction projects for military commanders. Future heroes received pensions, titles, cash payments, but never palaces. The precedent was too dangerous, the political liability too severe, the financial risk too enormous. In a very real sense, Blenheim Palace killed the tradition it was supposed to exemplify. It was meant to show that Britain honored its heroes magnificently. Instead, it showed that Britain couldn't afford to honor its heroes that magnificently. The lesson was learned, but at enormous cost. Treasury officials implemented new oversight procedures. Construction projects required detailed contracts. Budgets had to be approved line by line. All of this came directly from the Blenheim disaster. The palace literally rewrote government procurement rules. And here's the bitter irony. These new rules would have prevented Blenheim from ever being built. The project only happened because there were no safeguards. Once the safeguards were in place, projects like Blenheim became impossible. So Blenheim Palace stands alone, the only example of its kind. The first and last British palace built by the government for a non-royal. Because the cost of building the first one made sure there would never be a second. But wait, there's more. Because the construction cost was only the beginning. Let me show you what it costs to maintain a palace. In the 18th century, Blenheim Palace required a full-time staff of over 100 people: gardeners, cleaners, maintenance workers, security, administrative staff. The annual payroll alone was £5,000. In today's money, about $1.25 million per year, just for staff. Then there's heating. The palace has 187 rooms. In winter, keeping them heated required tons of coal. Annual heating costs £2,000, $500,000 today. Repairs and maintenance £3,000 annually, $750,000 today. Property taxes and fees £1,500, $375,000 today. Total annual operating cost in the 18th century, £11,500. In today's money, that's approximately $2.875 million per year. Every year. Forever. The Churchill family's annual income from their estates was approximately £10,000. So maintaining the palace consumed over 100% of one annual income stream. They had to use income from other sources, sell properties, take loans. The palace was a constant financial drain, and it only got worse. By the 19th century, deferred maintenance had created serious structural problems. The roof was leaking, the stone was crumbling, the drainage systems were failing. In 1850, the 6th Duke of Marlborough commissioned a full structural survey. Estimated repairs needed £40,000, $6 million today. He didn't have it. The palace continued deteriorating. By 1870, sections of the building were unusable. Water damage had destroyed interior decorations. Structural instability made some rooms dangerous. The family was facing a choice: invest an enormous fortune in repairs or watch their ancestral home crumble. That's when they found Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her $2.5 million dowry, $78 million today, didn't just pay off old debts. It funded the massive restoration the palace desperately needed. American industrial money saved the British aristocratic monument. But think about the timeline. The palace was finished in 1722. By 1870, just 148 years later, it needed a complete restoration worth more than double the original construction cost. The building that cost £300,000 to build required £100,000 plus to repair. And that cycle has repeated. Major restorations in 1929, in 1952, in 1988, in 2004, each costing millions. The palace hasn't just been expensive once, it's been expensive continuously for 300 years. Today, Blenheim Palace operates as a business. It's open to the public, it hosts events, it runs tours. Annual revenue, approximately £10 million. Sounds impressive, right? But annual operating costs, approximately £8 million. Net income, £2 million per year. That £2 million has to cover staff pensions, deferred maintenance insurance, emergency repairs, capital improvements. The palace barely breaks even. And that's with 800,000 plus visitors per year paying admission. Without tourism revenue, the palace would be financially impossible to maintain. The Churchill family, now the Spencer Churchill family, essentially runs a heritage tourism business to afford living in their ancestral home. They don't own a palace, they manage a historic attraction that they happen to live in. And here's the reality nobody discusses. If tourism ever declines significantly, an economic recession, a pandemic, changing travel patterns, the financial model collapses. The palace that has survived 300 years could become financially unsustainable in a single bad decade. This isn't speculation. It nearly happened during COVID-19. In 2020, the palace was closed for months. Revenue dropped by 70%. The family had to take emergency loans to cover operating costs. A 300-year-old monument to military triumph nearly went bankrupt because of a virus. That's the reality of display architecture. It's never finished demanding money. Let me bring this home. Blenheim Palace stands today as one of Britain's most celebrated buildings. Over 800,000 people visit every year. It generates approximately £10 million annually in tourism revenue. The palace is beautiful, impressive, historically significant. But here's what those 800,000 visitors don't see. The £300,000 that should have been £50,000. The 17 years that should have been 5. The royal friendship destroyed by financial pressure. The architect who fled his greatest work. The family patriarch who suffered a stroke from the stress. The matriarch who spent decades fighting creditors and eventually called it that heap of stones. The generations of debt that followed. The American heiress money that finally paid it off 170 years later. The contractors who went bankrupt. The workers who lost their livelihoods. The town whose economy was devastated. The continuous financial drain that has never stopped. The modern reality where the palace must operate as a business just to survive. They see the triumph. I'm showing you the cost because the cost matters. Queen Anne made a promise in 1705 that the government would build John Churchill a palace. She didn't put it in writing, didn't set a budget, didn't establish oversight, just a promise. That promise cost the equivalent of $75 million initially. It's cost hundreds of millions more in the 3 centuries since. It created political scandals that lasted 2 decades. It destroyed a friendship that had lasted 30 years. It consumed the architect's career and reputation. It broke John Churchill's health. It became Sarah Churchill's obsession and burden. It ruined contractors and workers. It damaged a town's economy, and it saddled the family with financial obligations that continue to this day. All for a building that John Churchill lived in for 3 years. 3 years. So let me ask you this. When is a reward not a reward? When it costs more than you can afford. When it demands more than you can give. When it destroys more than it celebrates. When it becomes a burden instead of a gift. When it never stops taking. Blenheim Palace is called one of Britain's greatest architectural achievements. I've just shown you why it's actually one of Britain's most catastrophic financial disasters, the palace that shouldn't exist. But it does exist. And it's still costing money, still demanding attention, still consuming resources. 300 years later, Let me show you the complete accounting. Initial construction, 1705 to 1722. Original estimate, £50,000, $12 million today. Final cost, £300,000, $75 million today. Cost overrun, 600% government funding provided, £220,000, $55 million today. Churchill family personal cost, £80,000, plus $20 million today. Post-construction costs, 1722 to 1870. Annual maintenance average, £11,500, $2.875 million today. Total over 148 years, £1,702,000, $425 million today. Major restoration, 1850s, £40,000, $6 million today. Vanderbilt rescue, 1874. Dowry payment, $2.5 million, $78 million today. 20th century costs, restoration. 1929, £200,000, $18 million today. Restoration. 1952, £500,000, $24 million today. Restoration 1988, £2 million, $6 million today. Restoration 2004, £15 million, $30 million today. Total historical cost, 1705 to 2024, approximately £2.8 million in period money, equivalent to approximately $650 million in today's currency. Human costs, construction timeline, 17 years instead of 5. John Churchill's enjoyment, 3 years before death. Sarah Churchill's burden, 44 years of debt and regret, generations financially affected. 7. Until tourism model established, workers dismissed without pay. 400-plus contractors bankrupted, dozens political careers damaged, countless royal friendship destroyed. 1. Irreversibly national scandals created, multiple lasting decades, town economy damaged. 1. For decades, years, until financial sustainability. 280-plus, not achieved until 1990s tourism boom. Current reality, annual revenue, £10 million. Annual costs, £8 million. Net margin, 20%. Financial stability, dependent on continuous tourism. Risk level, high, vulnerable to economic, social disruptions. And nobody's talking about this because it challenges everything we believe about monuments, rewards, and legacy. We want to believe that great achievements deserve great rewards. We want to believe that expense is justified by significance. We want to believe that buildings can capture glory without creating burden. We want to believe that monuments last forever without cost. But Blenheim Palace proves otherwise. Glory is expensive. Display is destructive. Monuments require maintenance, and rewards can become curses. The palace still stands. But so does the lesson. If you're interested in the real story behind America's Gilded Age families who learned this lesson the hard way, watch my next video about the Vanderbilt family. They built palaces too. 9 of them, actually, and lost every single one. I'll show you exactly how $200 million vanished in just 3 generations. Because the Vanderbilts made the same mistake the Churchills made. They built for display. And display destroys wealth. Every single time. But before we end, I need to show you something crucial. Because Blenheim Palace isn't an anomaly. It's a template. All of this came directly from the Blenheim disaster. The palace literally rewrote government procurement rules. And here's the bitter irony. These new rules would have prevented Blenheim from ever being built. The project only happened because there were no safeguards. Once the safeguards were in place, projects like Blenheim became impossible. So Blenheim Palace stands alone, the only example of its kind. The first and last British palace built by the government for a non-royal. Because the cost of building the first one made sure there would never be a second. But wait, there's more. Because the construction cost was only the beginning. Let me show you what it costs to maintain a palace. In the 18th century, Blenheim Palace required a full-time staff of over 100 people, gardeners, cleaners, maintenance workers, security, administrative staff. The annual payroll alone was £5,000. In today's money, about $1.25 million per year, just for staff. Then there's heating. The palace has 187 rooms. In winter, keeping them heated required tons of coal. Annual heating costs £2,000, $500,000 today. Repairs and maintenance, £3,000 annually, $750,000 today. Property taxes and fees, £1,500, $375,000 today. Total annual operating cost in the 18th century, £11,500. In today's money, that's approximately $2.875 million per year. Every year. Forever. The Churchill family's annual income from their estates was approximately £10,000. So maintaining the palace consumed over 100% of one annual income stream. They had to use income from other sources, sell properties, take loans. The palace was a constant financial drain, and it only got worse. By the 19th century, deferred maintenance had created serious structural problems. The roof was leaking, the stone was crumbling, the drainage systems were failing. In 1850, the 6th Duke of Marlborough commissioned a full structural survey. Estimated repairs needed £40,000, $6 million today. He didn't have it. The palace continued deteriorating. By 1870, sections of the building were unusable. Water damage had destroyed interior decorations. Structural instability made some rooms dangerous. The family was facing a choice: invest an enormous fortune in repairs or watch their ancestral home crumble. That's when they found Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her $2.5 million dowry, $78 million today, didn't just pay off old debts. It funded the massive restoration the palace desperately needed. American industrial money saved the British aristocratic monument. But think about the timeline. The palace was finished in 1722. By 1870, just 148 years later, it needed a complete restoration worth more than double the original construction cost. The building that cost £300,000 to build required £100,000 plus to repair. And that cycle has repeated. Major restorations in 1929, in 1952, in 1988, in 2004, each costing millions. The palace hasn't just been expensive once, it's been expensive continuously for 300 years. Today, Blenheim Palace operates as a business. It's open to the public, it hosts events, it runs tours. Annual revenue, approximately £10 million. Sounds impressive, right? But annual operating costs, approximately £8 million. Net income, £2 million per year. That £2 million has to cover staff pensions, deferred maintenance insurance, emergency repairs, capital improvements. The palace barely breaks even. And that's with 800,000 plus visitors per year paying admission. Without tourism revenue, the palace would be financially impossible to maintain. The Churchill family, now the Spencer Churchill family, essentially runs a heritage tourism business to afford living in their ancestral home. They don't own a palace, they manage a historic attraction that they happen to live in. And here's the reality nobody discusses. If tourism ever declines significantly, an economic recession, a pandemic, changing travel patterns, the financial model collapses. The palace that has survived 300 years could become financially unsustainable in a single bad decade. This isn't speculation. It nearly happened during COVID-19. In 2020, the palace was closed for months. Revenue dropped by 70%. The family had to take emergency loans to cover operating costs. A 300-year-old monument to military triumph nearly went bankrupt because of a virus. That's the reality of display architecture. It's never finished demanding money. Let me bring this home. Blenheim Palace stands today as one of Britain's most celebrated buildings. Over 800,000 people visit every year. It generates approximately £10 million annually in tourism revenue. The palace is beautiful, impressive, historically significant. But here's what those 800,000 visitors don't see. The £300,000 that should have been £50,000. The 17 years that should have been 5. How? They didn't build monuments. They bought productive assets. They invested conservatively. They lived below their means. No palaces, no yachts, no grand estates, just quiet, sustainable wealth management. And their descendants are still wealthy today. Nobody writes articles about them. Nobody tours their modest homes. Nobody celebrates their restraint. But their money lasted. The families with the monuments broke. So here's the harsh truth about Blenheim Palace and every building like it. They're beautiful failures, architectural triumphs and financial disasters, display victories and economic defeats. We celebrate them because they're impressive. But we should study them as warnings, because the real question isn't, can you afford to build it? The real question is, can you afford to keep it? And the answer, throughout history, is almost always no. But here's what frustrates me most. This isn't hidden knowledge. The story of Blenheim Palace is documented. The cost overruns are recorded. The family struggles are known, yet people keep making the same mistake. In 2019, a crypto billionaire commissioned a 300-foot yacht. Original budget, $150 million. Current cost, over $250 million. Annual maintenance, $20 million. He's 34 years old. At current costs, that yacht will consume $1 billion over his lifetime. For a boat. When I see stories like this, I think of Sarah Churchill, sitting in Blenheim Palace in 1742, looking at that heap of stones, wishing it had never been built. The crypto billionaire thinks he's different. Everyone does. They think, I have enough money. I can afford the maintenance. This won't happen to me. John Churchill thought that too. He was one of the most powerful men in Europe. He'd won one of history's most significant battles. He had royal favor and vast estates. And the palace still broke him, because monuments don't care about your wealth. They only care about their costs. And those costs never stop. Let me end with the most uncomfortable truth of all. Blenheim Palace still exists. It's beautiful. It's maintained. It survives. So you might ask, if it's such a disaster, why is it still here? Here's why. It survived because hundreds of people sacrificed their financial security to maintain it. John Churchill, Sarah Churchill, their children, their grandchildren, dozens of contractors, hundreds of workers, entire generations of the Churchill family, and finally, an American heiress who had no connection to the building but whose money was married into the family. The palace stands because people paid, and paid, and paid. For 300 years, people have paid. That's not a triumph. That's a tragedy with a pretty facade, because here's what nobody admits. If you add up all the costs, construction, maintenance, restorations, opportunity costs, financial stress, ruined lives, Blenheim Palace has consumed over $1 billion in value. For what? A building that the man it was built for lived in for 3 years, a monument that the woman who fought for it eventually called a heap of stones. An architectural masterpiece that requires $8 million annually just to keep standing. You can visit it, you can admire it, you can call it a triumph of British architecture. But don't forget what it cost, and don't forget that the cost hasn't stopped, because monuments never stop taking. They only stop when nobody's left to pay. So what's the lesson of Blenheim Palace? It's simple. Build for use, not display. Spend for function, not impression. Invest for returns, not monuments. And remember, the building stops when construction ends. The costs continue forever. Queen Anne wanted to honor John Churchill's achievement. She succeeded. But the honor cost more than the achievement was worth. And that's the truth about Blenheim Palace. It's a magnificent, beautiful, historically significant disaster. A palace that shouldn't exist, but does. At enormous cost that never ends. Thank you for watching. If this video changed how you think about wealth, display, and monuments, leave a comment telling me which historic building you want me to investigate next. Because Blenheim isn't alone. There are dozens of stories like this, palaces, mansions, and estates that consumed the families who built them, and I'm going to show you every single one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Display destroys wealth every single time. I'll see you in the next video.